Stanley Karnow, author of the new book, In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines. When did you first think you wanted to be a writer?
Well, it goes back, you know, all these stories, it goes back to your jelly pad when you're 8 years old and you print your own newspaper for your friends in school. And I guess it was when I started out in high school, getting a school newspaper, being an editor of my college newspaper. It's something I always wanted to do. And you use the word writer. I consider myself to be journalist if there's perhaps a conflict in those terms. But I've really spent all my life, professional and non-professional, in the field of journalism.
What's the difference between being a journalist and a writer?
Well, let's put it this way. Journalists are writers, but not all writers are journalists. And I use the distinction because the word journalism contains the French word jour, which means day, and there is a time quality, a temporal quality to journalism as opposed to literature, poetry. You really are under pressure as a journalist. That same pressure exists, I discovered, if you're working for a wire service or you're working for a newspaper, a daily newspaper, or you're working for a magazine, a weekly magazine, or a monthly magazine, or even if you're writing books. I mean, books take a long time, but still you have a deadline. You want to accomplish it, you want to finish it within a time framework. I'm not saying that poets don't try to finish their poems with a certain deadline, but the other aspect of journalism is that it's nonfiction. It may be vivid, it may read like fiction, and I try in my histories or current affairs books to make it vivid and to bring the journalists' instruments and tools to it in depicting things as if they're actually happening under my very eyes, even though they may have happened 100 years ago, which requires a lot of research. I guarantee I don't invent it. I go back and read old newspapers, or if I can, interview people who have recollections. So I try to get that kinetic, live quality into it because if I can go on, because I believe that history is made by people. It's not made by cosmic forces. It's not ordained or preordained. And so I want to tell it in terms of people.
Can you remember back in those early days why you were even interested in being a journalist in the first place?
Well, it's hard to remember what my motives were. I guess I like to write. I liked to toy with words. I remember when I was in high school, I used to write radio plays. This is before the days of television, which dates me. I liked the drama of that, and I liked observing events and then trying to recreate them and analyze them if I could. Of course, I started out as a sports writer in high school. I was the sports editor of the paper. I don't pay much attention to sports anymore, but that was a glamorous thing to do when you were a high school kid. You went to all the football games, and the cheerleaders got to know you, and it was a nice avocation as a high school student. Later in college, as an editor of the paper, I mostly concentrated on editorials, but also liked to write light feature stuff. In those days, my inspiration was the New Yorker magazine, which was funny and lively. I think it's gotten a bit ponderous in recent years. So I got launched, if you want, or I launched myself in that, and like everybody getting out of college, went out to look for a job and had a very kind of odd way of finding a professional job. I went over to Paris after I graduated from college. I went over there for the summer, liked it, was intrigued and captivated by it, and stayed on. Fortunately, in those days, we had the GI Bill. I had been in the Army during the Second World War, so I had something like 3 or 4 years of GI Bill coming to me. Those were the days when the dollar was strong, and believe it or not, you could actually live in Paris on $100 a month. I mean, today it barely pays for lunch. And so I kind of hung out, if you want. I mean, I enrolled in school in order to get my GI Bill, did go to classes, did get the required diplomas and so forth, of which are really valueless in a way. But by some chance, I got hired by Time magazine, first as a spear carrier and a general factotum. I spoke French by this stage, and eventually became a correspondent for Time, and that was the beginning of my professional career back in 1950.
I want to get to some more of that and some of the work you did for the Washington Post and others, but first I want to ask you, first show the audience what your book looks like. And by now they've probably seen it in the bookstores, they've seen the part of the television show that you're doing with PBS. The first question I want to ask you, and I know this book is about the Philippines, is right down at the bottom, Author of Vietnam, A History. That book also was made into a television series on PBS. Where did you get the idea to combine your books with television?
Well, I felt that that television could do a lot of things in telling a story. I mean, you can't really dramatize certain events in words in the same way you could do it on the screen. I mean, the old Chinese adage about a picture being worth 1,000 words, I think, is modest. I think a good picture might be worth a whole chapter in a book. And certain events, very dramatic events, are just almost impossible to capture in words. But television has its limitations. It's very hard in an ongoing documentary to analyze things. Television requires images and visuals. It requires photographs or film. For example, if you're trying to deal with a diplomatic negotiation, what have you got on television? What have you got to deal with? Usually you can't get into the room to listen to people bargaining. So you either have the opening shot that the negotiators allow the television cameras to do, or you get pictures of people getting in and out of cars. None of that's very satisfactory. And there's a limited attention span, I think, on the part of the viewer for an analysis of what's going on inside that room. But you can do that in a book. In this book, for example, I was able to obtain the transcript of a debate that went on in the Reagan administration in February 1986 over what to do about Ferdinand Marcos in those final days in the Philippines. And so I have the actual dialogue of that meeting, what Secretary of State Schultz said to Secretary of Defense Weinberger, later in the day what President Reagan said to both of them. And I can take the time in the book, I can take the space in the book to describe it. So the book analyzes, interprets, whereas television shows and dramatizes. And I think a combination of the two complement each other. And I think give you this rounder picture, this broader canvas, or two canvases to work on.
Back to that first book you did this joint project of the Vietnam history. Whose idea was it to do the combination of television and the book?
Well, the idea of the television series was proposed to me by Lawrence K. Grossman, who was then the president of public broadcasting. In a rather nice setting, we were lying on the beach in Nantucket the summer of 1977, I think it was, and he said, what about doing a television series on Vietnam? And I had spent a lot of time in Vietnam, longer than I'd like to recall, in fact. And
how long, by the way?
Well, I started going out there in the 50s. So I was there from the 50s, and then even, in fact, before the television series in the book went back in the early 1980s. So I clocked about 25 years of in and out of Vietnam. At any rate, Grossman proposed the television series. I thought it was a very good idea, and I thought it was very far-sighted of him at that particular time. This was 2 years after the fall of Saigon to the communists. The American public was thoroughly uninterested in the subject, and it took us 7 years to do it. And by the time we did come out, I think attitudes had changed. I like to think that maybe we contributed after coming out to changing the attitudes. But by that time, the Vietnam Memorial had gone up or was going up in Washington. Veterans were getting a new look. And so we were part of this whole new interest in the Vietnam story, which of course has proliferated and expanded since then. In the course, at the very beginning, when the idea of doing a television series attracted me, I also began to think that I wanted to do a book that went with it as a companion. You can either call the book the companion to the series or the series the companion to the book, whatever.
But the series started first in your mind?
Well, the idea of the series started first, yes. And then I did the book actually along with the series. It wasn't as if I wrote the book and then the series was derived from the book. I'd run up and work, do my interviews or whatever, do my writing for the series, then run back and work on the book for a while. The research of one helped the other. And so I was doing them in tandem, which was quite a load to carry, I might add. At any rate, I am not a filmmaker. I'm a writer. And I had done some television documentaries before, but I did have to learn about what it's like to work on television, although I had marvelous people working with me, the executive producer, Dick Ellison, others, Lawrence Lichty, who was the head of research. And so I saw it very early on as a combination, as a package of a book and a television series. Others had been doing this for some time. You had Carl Sagan doing Cosmos, Kenneth Clark on Civilization, Bernofsky, Abi Eban on the history of the Jews, and so forth. And I think it's a very good idea. I think it doesn't always work, but when it does, it has a lot of impact.
You may tell me this is none of my business, but how does someone over a 7-year period live day to day? Did they pay you during this period? I mean, you hear people working on books for all these years, and you wonder how they make it.
Well, you want to get a handsome advance if you can. Although it's not a way to make money. I mean, working on these things, you know, you could be a teller in a bank and probably make more money than you make writing, even though a lot of people think I became a multimillionaire because the book, the Vietnam book, sold remarkably well. I was doing other things on the side. I was doing some other writing and editing, and I'd saved some money, and I was getting paid in a modest way by the television project as well. So while I wasn't getting rich, it was all right. It was comfortable, but you know, I don't work for money. I mean, I like to earn money. I'm not going to. Dr. Johnson once said, "Nobody but a blockhead writes except for money." But there are other satisfactions, I think, in writing. And if you looked at the average writer across the country, you'd probably find that the mean income is something like $6,000 a year. So while you read about these glitzy contracts of people getting multi-million-dollar advances, you also have to bear in mind that there are a lot of writers who are struggling.
When do you feel a sense of satisfaction? What is it?
Well, it's every step of the way. First you organize, you plan what you're going to do. And you know perfectly well, as you start, when you got a grasp of the subject, this is before you've ever even done the research, but you have a kind of roadmap of where you want to go. And that's very important. You may not follow that outline. I think it's very important to do a good job of outlining what you want to do, even if you throw it away. And usually you don't follow it exactly. When I was a young reporter in Paris, I interviewed the great abstract painter Georges Braque, who said to me, if I knew what was going to come out on the canvas, I wouldn't bother to paint it, because things develop as you go along. So that first sense of satisfaction is getting an idea of where you're going. Then you start researching, and researching is a little bit like panning for gold. You can just lie by that stream, you know, looking for those nuggets to come along, and every once in a while something does come along, and that gives you a great sense of satisfaction. interviewing people is fun in many ways, especially if you have time to do it, and you can let it spread out a bit, and you can help the person you're interviewing get over that initial nervousness, especially if you're doing it jointly on camera. Many of the interviews I do in the book were being done on camera, or sometimes I would do a pre-interview to determine what I was going to ask them when we taped them on camera. That takes time, and then you begin to hear those things. Not that you're trying to direct the person to say something, but then you know that maybe you're getting something original from this person, or some new anecdote that hasn't been told before. Then you plunge into archives and start digging out all kinds of things, and there again, it's you know, you're down there with your helmet and light on in that coal mine, you know, chipping away, or that gold mine, looking for this material. Then you get it all, and pardon me if I mix my metaphor, you're a bit like a sculptor with this enormous piece of granite. And then you got to chip away at that granite in order to mold that sculpture. And that is a very hard process. I don't know any writer who thinks that writing is fun. It's hard work. And the way I did it and do it is just as if I'm doing any other job. I get up in the morning and I have breakfast and read the newspapers and shave and shower and get dressed. But I go down to my cellar where I have my study and work. And I try to get to my machine by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And sometimes I'll run out of steam in the afternoon, but sometimes I'll go until midnight. But you have to treat it as a job. You have to be disciplined. You don't sit around waiting for inspiration. If you do, you're never going to get anything done, because it's much more fun taking the dog out for a walk along the canal than sitting down there and writing. But again, getting back to your point about the thing that keeps you going, I think, is that you have these peaks in which you really do begin to feel that you're getting the story told, and this chapter looks pretty good. Very often it looks good, and you put it aside, and you look at it 2 weeks later, and it looks terrible. And so you go back and you work on it again. Or maybe your editor doesn't like it very much, or only partly likes it. So what I'm trying to say is that there are moments of troughs when you're not feeling like working. The best thing to do in those moments is just to get up and take a walk. When you get the whole thing finished, there is that great sense of satisfaction of having completed it and kept it within some sort of reasonable bounds. I write books for the public. I'm not an academic, and I don't want to throw 24 volumes at people. And I assure you that I had enough material to do a 24-volume account of the story, but I wanted to keep it within obviously reasonable bounds. Then you wait, and you're in a limbo until the reviews start coming out. In this book, In Our Image, I must say that I've been extremely fortunate. I've had much better reviews than I would have dreamed of having. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe have all been very kind. And then again, because you put in so much time, you wait to see you cock your ear for the ring of the cash register to see whether the book is going to be a good seller, a bestseller. I think that in my own mind, I'm much more interested in the longevity of the book, what the publishers call the shelf life of the book, than I am in the immediate impact. I mean, I'm not going to I'm not going to dissimulate and say I don't like to sell books. I think every writer does. But I really hope that the book is around for a long time. The Vietnam book was published in late '83. It's still on the shelves. It's being used in schools, along with the television series. And I must say they get a great sense of satisfaction and gratification when some high school student or college student calls me up and in effect asks me to do his term paper for him. You know, my wife hands me the phone. She said, here's another call from Iowa State or the University of Florida, and there's some college sophomore there who's taking a course in Vietnam and wants to ask me some questions, which if he or she were a little more enterprising, they could probably find the answers to in the book, but maybe they just want to talk on the phone, bounce some ideas. And that's very good. I get a lot of satisfaction out of that. I get a lot of letters from veterans, from Vietnamese refugees or immigrants now living in this country. So you get the sense that you've put something into the world that's still there, that you know, wasn't one of those quickie sensations that that came and went. And so I find, you know, that gives me the sense of some sense of achievement. I find the same thing if I go out lecturing, which I do as often as I can in universities. Don't forget that it's interesting about Vietnam, that is that you have a whole generation of Americans who lived through it, either veterans of the war, GIs or grunts as we call them. You have the Americans of that generation who lived at home, either students who were protesting against the war, people who were supporting it. And then you have a whole generation of Americans who weren't even born when we got involved. And there's an intense interest in Vietnam in the universities and even in the high schools. So that all contributes to this continuing interest in the subject, and I do feel that it does give me some role to play in dealing with the subject. Now, again, in this book, in our image, it's really a book about America, not about the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines is the landscape, but the story is about America going abroad for the first time in its history at the turn of the century and becoming a colonial power, what we did in our colony and what we've left behind. And I think there's no other book that spans this period.
Who's this gentleman?
Theodore Roosevelt, one of the architects of our war with Spain, and the man who was responsible, in fact, for ordering Commodore George Dewey, who was then commander of a small squadron of American ships in Asia. Teddy Roosevelt ordered Dewey to Manila, and that was the beginning of our involvement in the Philippines.
Are you driven to write as a journalist to transfer information, or do you find yourself having a strong point of view now at this point in your life and you want the rest of the world to know your point of view?
To tell you the truth, I'm not out grinding axes. I do obviously have a point of view. I mean, I think only an amoeba doesn't have a point of view. Any human being, the idea of objectivity doesn't exist. I mean, the minute we begin to choose anecdotes in telling our stories, we are becoming subjective. What I try to do is to be fair, which is different from being objective, which is to tell the various sides of the story. But overall, I believe that if you marshal your information, if you tell a story, and you are putting some guidance in there, you're selecting certain things that are trying to make your point, but overall, I like a debate to come out of it. I'd like various readers to find different things in it. And they do. I've had this from experience. Again, going back to Vietnam, because it's too early to, the results in this one it's too early to tell. But on Vietnam, I found myself denounced by the extreme left and the extreme right, and I figured as a result I must be doing something right, because I consider myself to be a member of the extreme center. But I want to tell all the stories. I don't want to try to bombard a reader with my opinions. It becomes boring. It becomes polemical. And when you get into history, into the past. It's a marvelous, fertile field for a storyteller. I mean, so much of what went on in the past is amusing, it's interesting, it's lively. I'm not a novelist. Sometimes I wish I were. But you don't have to be a novelist to tell interesting stories.
Who's this gentleman?
That's Arthur MacArthur, who was a general at the turn of the century in the Philippines, one of the early American commanders, and the father of the illustrious Douglas MacArthur, who later became the American who probably served longer and was most heralded by the Filipinos.
What impact did he have on our relationships with the Philippines?
Well, he was there at this early period. After we had landed in the Philippines in 1898, we defeated the Spanish. As I said, Dewey defeated the Spanish fleet in 7 hours on May 1st, 1898, with the loss of only one man who died of heat prostration. Then American troops began to come out to fight the Spanish, and there was no battle. It was the Spanish surrendered in August of 1898, so there wasn't any real war against the Spanish in the Philippines, as there was in Cuba, which is really the main reason we went to war against Spain in 1898. After defeating the Spanish in the summer of 1988, there was a lot of doubt about what was going to happen in the Philippines. We had a conspicuously indecisive president at the time, William McKinley. And he couldn't make up his mind what to do. And eventually, however, he decided that he was going to annex the Philippines, to keep the Philippines. He explained afterward to a group of Methodist clergymen that he could not make up his mind, but he said he was paced the floor of the White House night after night, and even get down on his knees and pray to God for guidance. And then this divine intervention came in answer to his prayers, and he was told to take the Filipinos and uplift them and Christianize them, as he put it. Of course, they were all Catholics, having been under Spanish rule for 300 years. But it was an example of how little McKinley knew about the Philippines, which he admitted, by the way, that he couldn't locate on the map. So we decided to retain these islands. But there was a Philippine nationalist movement that had declared independence. So we went to war to conquer the Philippines. The war is officially called the Philippine Insurrection in our official records. In fact, it was a war of conquest, I mean, to put it bluntly. And some 4,000 Americans died in that war, and perhaps 200,000 Filipinos died as well. So it was a rather bloody war. It lasted 2.5 years. But we did conquer this movement. Partly it's because the Filipino nationalist movement was inept and disorganized. And then we began our rule of the Philippines.
This is a classic picture. Who is this?
Now, who are you looking at, the water buffalo or the man sitting on it? The question, of course, is who weighs more? The man on the water buffalo was William Howard Taft, who was the first American civilian governor of the Philippines. Came out there in 1901 and stayed for 4 years. Later went home to become Secretary of War at a time when the War Department was responsible for the administration of the Philippines, and of course later was elected president. And never forgot those early years in the Philippines. And these 13 years or so when he was governor, Secretary of War, and president, he was quite responsible, very responsible for setting the pattern of our colonial rule that lasted until 1946.
When he was there, how many Filipinos were there?
Probably around, the population was probably around 8 million, 6 to 8 million There'd never really been a census, and it was, in those years, of course, a fairly large population. It's interesting that a Filipino movement, a political party called the Federalista Party, which Taft had helped to organize and finance, had as one of its planks statehood for the Philippines. And its leaders came to Washington in 1904 to plead for statehood, to become a part of the Union. And the Secretary of State at the time, L.E. Root, rejected them largely on racial grounds. He claimed that we had a racial problem in the United States and he didn't want any, quote, more colored people in this country. Those were the mores of the time. Those were the norms of the time, I might say. Another factor, of course, was to bring an area of 8 million people into the Union would have made it the biggest state in the Union. And it would have been rather odd to have the, so to speak, to have the tail wagging the dog. I mean, you would have had more Filipino congressmen than congressmen from any other state. Incidentally, to this day, there's a statehood movement which claims about 5 million members. The Philippines today has a population of about 60 million. So imagine how many Filipino congressmen you'd have up on Capitol Hill if the Philippines ever became a state.
This picture.
That is President Franklin D. Roosevelt signing into law in 1935 the legislation that turned the Philippines into a commonwealth and also, more importantly, scheduled independence for 10 years later. Of course, independence was delayed for a year because of the Second World War.
We have another photograph here of another president and a couple of other figures that the audience may recognize. Who's the gentleman with the top hat out front?
The man with the straw hat, is Douglas MacArthur. Then the military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth government. He had been chief of staff in Washington. He retired and then was offered this job to go out there and to help form a Filipino army. Now the man behind him, also in the white suit, is directly to his right, is that sort of baby-faced gentleman there, is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was then a major and was MacArthur's deputy, chief of staff, during that period of the 1930s. They hated each other. They had terrible fights. Eisenhower was later asked, did you ever know General MacArthur? And he said, yes, I studied dramatics under him for 7 years. Years later, when Eisenhower was president, somebody asked MacArthur if he knew Eisenhower, had known Eisenhower, to which MacArthur replied, best clerk I ever had. There was something incompatible about their characters. MacArthur was a monumental egotist, a talented man, a skilled man in many ways. Eisenhower was essentially a rather modest man, and they disagreed over policy. MacArthur was absolutely convinced that his plan for defending the Philippines would work, and Eisenhower had strong doubts about it. And in the end, they broke up, and they disliked each other intensely.
What impact did General MacArthur have on what we know today as the Philippines?
The big thing that MacArthur did, and what it really has made him almost a deity to the Filipinos, is that soon after the outbreak of World War II, and the Japanese occupied the Philippines, and MacArthur was forced to leave the country. He left his little redoubt on the island of Corregidor and fled to Australia. And he vowed to return, those famous words of his, I shall return. Incidentally, it wasn't we shall return, it was I shall return. Again, a reflection of this ego. And he did. He did. In 1944, as he fought his way up through the Pacific, he approached the Philippines, and there was a big debate in Washington among the strategists of where he should go next on his way, or as the American forces approached Japan. And many strategists in the Navy and Army wanted to attack the island of Taiwan. MacArthur insisted that we had a commitment to liberate the Philippines, and he finally won that debate, and he did liberate the Philippines. And I went back to the Philippines with MacArthur on his final journey there in 1961, what he called his sentimental journey. Millions of people came out, and he could have got elected king if he decided to run. There was tremendous emotion, and to this day there still is toward MacArthur.
How much time did you spend around him?
Just those few weeks on his return. I served in Asia during the Second World War, fortunately not in his command. A lot of American soldiers, a lot of GIs had tremendous reverence for him. I was over in the China, Burma, India theater, and that was not the Pacific where he was. He was a man with faults as well. I mentioned the ego, his tremendous ego, which tended to blur the achievements of other generals in that theater. You remember, compare him to Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the supreme commander in Europe. We remember the names of the famous generals like Omar Bradley or Maxwell Taylor or Matthew Ridgway or George Patton, because Eisenhower gave them publicity. We only remember one man in the Pacific, although there were other very competent generals like Eichelberger, I'm sorry. But he blotted all those people out.
What was he like to sit and just talk to?
From my own brief experience with him, MacArthur tended to deliver speeches, and maybe this was because it was late in his life. He talked himself out. He'd said everything he was ever going to say in his life. I was a reporter. He wasn't about to let what little hair he had left down in front of me, and so I found those few occasions to be rather stilted, not terribly comfortable.
This picture. Top one.
That's Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Marcos. Marcos was the president of the Philippines, with Lyndon Johnson on a visit to Washington in 1966. And Lyndon Johnson wanted above all to persuade Marcos to send Filipino troops to Vietnam. And Marcos was very, very clever. He extracted a lot of money from Lyndon Johnson for 10 battalions of Filipino troops, but in fact only sent one over and used the rest of them to build roads for political purposes back home.
This photo.
There we have Ronald Reagan, then...
Oh, the one up here.
I'm sorry. That's Richard Nixon with the Marcoses, and to the right is Pat Nixon. They didn't get along very well. Nixon, whatever you may think of him, was sensitive to Marcos's efforts to manipulate him. And at the bottom we have Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, visiting Manila in 1969, dancing with the beautiful Imelda Marcos, while Nancy Reagan on the other side of the room dances with Marcos. That experience, that first trip that Ronald Reagan took to Manila, really scratched his mind, and from then on he kept referring to the Marcoses as his very good friends, and in the end was very, very reluctant to see them overthrown.
How would you describe the Filipino as a person?
There are very few peoples, if I might put it that way, in the world that I've encountered who are as hospitable and genuinely warm as the Filipinos are, especially toward an American. And looking at it from a point of view of a reporter, there is almost total access in the Philippines if you go over there as a journalist. I mean, you could almost, I'm not exaggerating to say that you could arrive on a Thursday evening and be having breakfast with the president of the country the next morning. The breakfast may stretch into lunch, it may stretch into dinner, and it may stretch into a weekend in the country with him. Filipinos are very talkative. Of course, I understand as a reporter that they want something. I mean, that they're trying to sell themselves or sell whatever policy they had. Nevertheless, there is a kind of congeniality in Filipinos, and it's not only the president, it's right down to the lowliest peasant. I want to add an interesting thing is that in the course of researching this book and the television series that we produced, we had to go out with the Filipino communists into their areas. And they're just as friendly and congenial as you might find in the government. So there is that extreme warmth, and you get a sense from Filipinos, even those who are rhetorically anti-American, rhetorically critical of the United States, that there is a profound feeling of a pro-American sentiment there that that transcends all that sort of nationalist rhetoric that you hear mainly in Manila.
And this is, I think, the final photo in your book.
That is President Corazon Aquino, Cori as we call her, delivering a speech to the joint sessions of Congress in September 1986, about 6 or 8 months after she was catapulted into office. And that was a really memorable moment. Her visit to Washington really was one of her crowning achievements. Interestingly enough, when she went down that aisle of the House, and the congressmen were all wearing yellow ties and yellow cummerbunds and yellow flowers because her color was yellow. All of that kind of sentimentality of Philippine-American relations bubbled up, and suddenly there was this great rediscovery by Americans of this connection that had gone back to the turn of the century.
What do you really think? It's impossible to ask what all Filipinos think of Americans, but what do the people who run the country, like Mrs. Aquino, think of us?
She said, and she's not a woman to simulate, she said in her speech before Congress that the 3 years that she was in exile in Boston from 1980 to 1983 were the 3 happiest years of her life. She'd gone to school in New York as a young woman. There are very strong ties. Now, there are 2 countries, and 2 countries obviously have their differences. But deep down, I think, it's my experience, that Filipinos do have a very strong pro-American sentiment. Some of the most harshest critics of the United States, when you do a little scratching, you discover their children live in the United States, they have American residence permits that permit them to come in and out of the United States, they own houses in the United States. When you get down into the villages, it's very rare that you don't find somebody who's got a cousin in San Diego or an uncle in Cleveland. There are 1.5 million Filipinos living in the United States, and they will soon be the largest Asian minority. So these ties are not going to disappear overnight. The issue at stake right now are the 2 American bases in the Philippines, the naval base and the airfield. The Filipinos want more money for them. Perhaps they deserve more money for them. There have been recent negotiations which produced an interim agreement. There are going to be new and fresh negotiations. I think a compromise of some sort will be reached.
What do you think, based on what you've seen in history, what will our relations be, say, 10 to 20 years from now?
Well, I would like let me put it in terms of what I'd like to see, rather than looking into my clouded crystal ball and predicting what in fact will happen. In terms of our relationship, I think the biggest challenge to the Filipinos is to develop a sense of their own national identity. Here's a country, and here's where history teaches us something. Here's a country whose whole history has been colonial history. In fact, there's no country in the world that has been a colony longer than the Philippines. The Spanish arrived there in the 16th century, and they finally got their independence in 1946. Before the Spanish arrived, there wasn't any sense of nationhood. The Filipinos have to develop this sense of nationhood. And that's going to be a major challenge for them. And only when they can do that can they begin to become truly independent from the United States, because their independence, the independence they got in 1946, was a kind of dependent independence. They've depended on us for aid, they depend on us for advice, they depend on us on numerous occasions to help them pull the chestnuts out of the fire. They're depending on us right now for help fighting the insurgency. So they have to make it on their own. And that's going to be the major challenge for them. And I think it will color their relationship with us. They have to be able to stand up as a truly sovereign nation.
This is what the cover of the book looks like. Stanley Karnow is our guest. The title is In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines. How much are they living in our image?
The image is there. When we went out there, we tried to turn the Filipinos into facsimile Americans, and we did to a certain extent. Filipinos copied our music, they copied our dress. We taught English, and English is still the common language of the country. Young Filipinos dream of going to American universities. That gives them a big cachet when they come home. But deep down, they still have their own values, and their values are different from ours. We have a society that we like to think is based on civic virtue, on impersonal institutions. Philippine society is based on personal relationships. It's based on family ties and ritual kinship ties. And they march to a different drumbeat from us. I'm not going to judge whether theirs is better or not. So when you look back on this 100 years, almost 100 years of this American-Philippine relationship, the Americanization of the Philippines Americanized the Filipinos, but didn't make them Americans.
You born in New York City,
right?
1925.
Right.
Studied, got a degree from Harvard.
That's right.
Studied also at the Sorbonne in Paris. But a lot of your writings in the last several years have been out in the Far East. Where did you get your interest?
Well, I started out as a reporter in Paris in 1950, and worked there as a correspondent for Time magazine. Had some interludes back at Harvard as an Eman Fellow, 57, 58. And finally in 58, I had been spending a lot of time when I was based in Paris covering events in North Africa. There was a war going on, the Algerian War, an effort by the Algerian nationalists to gain their independence from France. So I actually opened my own bureau in North Africa. And as so often happens with big organizations, I'd hardly got settled down there. Then there was an opening in Hong Kong, and they said, would you like to go? And of course, I jumped at it. So, an example of how one's life can get steered by just some fortuitous change. I mean, some bureau might have been opened in South Africa or Latin America. Perhaps I would have gone there. But Asia always interested me. Not that I had any special knowledge. As I said, I had been out there during the Second World War, but I was just a GI and really didn't learn a lot. I did, though, as a GI in that area in South Asia, I just found it absolutely fascinating. I found it exotic, and I felt that even then I was only scratching the surface of it, and I really welcomed the chance to go back and learn more about it. And I can tell you one thing about Asia: the more you know, the less you know, because it's a, as they say, it's a lifetime university that never awards a degree, because you never get to the stage where you can claim any expertise. I think people who claim to be Asia experts are using the wrong word. I think you can say you're an Asia specialist, but it's a very complicated area, and I think we can learn a lot about it, and we have learned a lot about it. But it is subtle, complex, and different, and terribly different.
In this book about the Philippines, how many years did it take you to write it?
It took me about 4 years to do the book on the Philippines and the television series. But I like to say that I started going out there in the late 50s when I was assigned to Asia. So it's got something like 30 years of research in it, even though at the beginning I didn't have any idea of writing a book, but I was always gathering string and gathering notes. And my advice to every reporter is keep your notes. You never know what you're going to do with them someday.
How much actual shooting did you have to do, either videotape or film shooting, for your series on PBS?
We did hundreds, literally hundreds of interviews with everybody from Ferdinand Marcos and Imelda Marcos to President Aquino, various members of her cabinet, communist insurgents, and of course the other side, the American side, Secretary of State George Shultz, Admiral Crowe, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former ambassadors, CIA men, Americans who had grown up in the Philippines, who reminisced on what life was like in the 20s and 30s. And so we have a vast, vast archive of material, plus, that's film archive or taped archive, plus notes and books and audio tapes. There's pre-interviews we did, documents of all kinds. This country, given that Philippine experience, this country is a treasure trove of material, whether it's the National Archives in Washington, the Library of Congress, different university archives, Army war colleges like the one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. There's where our history reposes, and it's there. And anybody who wants to be a historian just needs a pass to go into these buildings, which are open to the public.
Did you do all the interviews yourself?
I did most of the interviews on camera. Again, having spent all those years out there, I knew all these people. So it was easy enough for me to call them and get to see them. I had the access. I think, however, that given their hospitality, the access would have been there for anybody.
What are you going to do with those hours and hours of interviews that never got into the 3 hours? Was it 3 hours of documentary on PBS?
Yeah, well, as usual, again, like writing a book, it's the chipping away at that big block of granite in order to produce that sculpture. I would hope that we could find a university or a foundation that would be interested in taking these things, because they are, I think, quite invaluable.
In your life, you worked for the Saturday Evening Post, NBC News, the Washington Post. You were an associate editor of the New Republic. Which of those did you enjoy the most?
Well, I've got this attitude of a reporter, which is the story I'm working on that day is the greatest story I've ever done in my life. And wherever I worked, I liked it. It's hard to, they were different kinds of media, and I adjusted myself to each one, or I tried to. Some gave me more satisfaction than others. Being able to write long pieces for the late and lamented old Saturday Evening Post was particularly satisfactory. But on the other hand, working for a daily newspaper was marvelous. Being out in Asia, being on your own, having receptive editors, and without getting a power complex, because I think that's the affliction of many journalists. But it was very nice to be able to write a story and know that the President of the United States was reading it the next morning, along with my wife's Aunt Katie, who was also one of my readers. So I find I must say that that I can't think of a better profession to be than a foreign correspondent. As I've often said, it's the only profession in which you remain an adolescent all your life, because it's fun, it's romantic, you're on your own, you have responsibilities, but you have freedom as well, and I regret as my own children are not terribly interested in that profession, but
What do they do?
my oldest son's a lawyer. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is an anthropologist. My daughter's a professional photographer and quite successful. And my youngest son is just about to graduate from Harvard.
We only have a couple minutes left. From what you've learned as a reporter and a journalist and a writer and a television producer over the years, somebody made you Secretary of State all of a sudden. What are some of the principles you would use in our foreign policy with the areas you've covered so much over there in Southeast Asia in that direction?
Well, let me preface it by saying I would reject the offer if I was offered the job. I think that the main thing we have to understand about dealing with other countries is that they've got their internal dynamics just as we have. Every time we face a foreign policy issue, and you study it carefully, you discover that domestic politics is probably the largest quotient in the formulation of foreign policy. Other countries have the same thing. We beef about the Japanese and their trade problems. They've got a legislature, they've got political parties, they've got pressure groups and vested interests. And the same is true whether you're going to talk about Asia or Europe. I think our biggest problem, because we're so new to the world, is that it's hard to put ourselves inside the skins of the people of other countries. And I think that's where you have to start. And when you don't do that, when you don't try to see things from their point of view, then you get into trouble. Mind you, it's very important that you have to realize that you are representing the United States, that that's your main client is the American public, is the American people. But you're only going to get along with other countries and progress in getting your problems dealt with if you try to understand it from their point of view. And that's a rare, we're so young that, we've only spent a few years out in the world. It's only essentially since the end of the Second World War that we've been really exercising authority and influence in the world.
Next project for Stanley Karnow?
I would like to look into the possibility of a book and another television series on this vast influx of Asians into the United States. Mind you, I am not calling it the yellow peril as some people are, just the contrary. The interesting thing about the Asians, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Indians, Pakistanis coming to the United States is they're coming in with all the old American virtues: family, hard work, risks, and endurance, stamina. And I think they're making a positive contribution to this country.
Here's the book, In Our Image, America's Empire in the Philippines. Stanley Karnow is the author, and he's been our guest for the last 60 minutes. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Brian.